What we saw in Jenin this week is not only a legal scandal, I think it's a theological scandal as well. And two Palestinian men, Al-Muntazir Abdullah and Yusuf Asana, walked out of a building in Jenin with their hands raised, shirts lifted to show they're unarmed and not wearing some sort of suicide belt, knelt on the ground, and they were shot at close range by Israeli border police. Multiple videos have confirmed confirmed by the international media, have shown what can only be described as an execution after surrender. Israeli authorities promise an investigation. The National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, simply says terrorists must die and applauds the shooters, but then, we know what he's like. He's a shit. Set this against the wider pattern. The UN agencies now speak of more than 1,600 settler attacks this year alone, affecting over 270 Palestinian communities across the West Bank, with injuries, home invasions, arson attacks on olive trees, and forced displacement of thousands. This is not random chaos, it is a project. And behind that project sits a particular way of reckoning the Torah and the Talmud. At its heart is a claim that the entire land between the river and the sea is not simply promised to the Jewish people, but already irrevocably their private property in the eyes of God. And on this reading, any Palestinian presence is at best a temporary tolerance, at worst a theft. Withdrawal, land swaps, or even shared sovereignty become forms of sacrilege. Violence to defend that ownership, even against unarmed civilians, is then dressed up as a religious duty. The texts usually invoked, and I've talked about this in the past, are well known. There's the command in Numbers 33:53, you shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, which Nachmanides famously counts as a positive commandment in every generation. There is Deuteronomy 7:2, with its lo tachanem, which the Talmud in Avodah Zarah reads as do not give them a permanent holding in the land, and which some modern rabbis inflate into a ban on any non-Jewish property or political claim anywhere in Eretz Yisrael. There are misused echoes of Amalek, where Palestinian villages are rhetorically folded into an eternal enemy to be blotted out. Add to that a certain Hasidic and hard-right religious Zionist tone that equates the land itself with God's very presence and speaks as though harming Palestinians is a way of insulting or avenging the Shekinah. The result is a theological gasoline, a petrol bomb, poured over every confrontation between armed settlers and armed shepherds. But that is not the only way, and I would argue not the honest way, to read the rabbinic tradition. First, the land, biblically, belongs, is never simply ours, it belongs to God. For the land is mine, you are strangers and sojourners with me. That's Leviticus 25:23. That verse is a direct rebuke to any theology of absolute ethnic ownership. Israel's title to the land is always conditional on justice, mercy, and the treatment of the weak. And the prophets never tire of saying that violence and oppression expel Israel from the land far more surely than any foreign army. And I think the present communities who are reading these texts in such an aggressive way, the settler communities, need to pay strict attention to Leviticus 25:23. Second, the very Talmudic passages, often cited by extremists, contain their own correctives. The same tractate that squeezes lo tachanem into a ban on granting chaniah to idolaters in the land also insists in Gettin 61a that Jews must support the poor of the Gentiles along with the poor of Israel, visit their sick, bury their dead for the sake of the ways of peace. That is not a footnote. It is a principle. Security for Jews must be founded on contempt, must not be founded on contempt for non-Jews. And parallel passages can be found in Islam, in the Quran, and in the Hadiths. You have already, you are aware of the Leviticus text. So now you need to look at the respect due to other religious buildings and communities, which is enshrined in the rabbinic texts, rabbinic discussions around robbing or desecrating Gentile temples, even where the worship is problematic, move steadily towards a firm ban, not because the rabbis suddenly liked paganism or Christianity or whatever, but because theft, humiliation, and violence are themselves grave sins. Later authorities expand on this. Theft from non-Jews is forbidden, cheating them in business is forbidden, damaging their property is forbidden, and all of this is codified in mainstream halakha. Third, the halakhic laws of life and death cut sharply against settler vigilantism and against what we saw in Jenin. The category of rodef, the pursuer who may be stopped with lethal force, is carefully hedged. A rodef must pose an immediate and concrete threat, and even then, the obligation is to use the least lethal means possible. A man kneeling on the ground with a shirt lifted to show he's unarmed is not a rodef. He is to shoot him is not self-defense, it is bloodshed. Pikur nafesh, the duty to save a life, overrides almost every commandment. The rabbis apply this not only to Jews, but in practice to any human life. To claim that extrajudicial killing, therefore, is a surrendered suspect, is a religiously meretricious act, is a grotesque inversion of that principle. And then there is the stark category of Chilul Hashem, the desecration of God's name. The Talmud says that when a Jew behaves violently or dishonestly towards Gentiles, and they say, woe to so-and-so who learn Torah, the name of heaven is dragged through the mud. Yoma 86a lists this as the most serious sin, harder to repair than almost any other. When settlers are filmed beating shepherds, torching olive groves, or parading through pogrom-like scenes in Huwara or Khalit al-Dabe, often with soldiers standing by, it's hard to think of a more literal case of Chilul Hashem. None of this denies that there are genuine security threats. There are attacks on Israelis, sometimes gruesome ones, but halakha knows the difference between policing and revenge, between self-defense and collective punishment, between a combatant actively engaged in violence and a child in a house, a shepherd on a hillside, or a pair of men on their knees with their hands in the air. The data collected by OCHA and others shows that settler violence is not a marginal phenomenon, but a systematic pattern of intimidation, displacement, and land grabbing, in which Palestinians are beaten, shot at, or driven from their villages when Israeli forces fail to intervene or at times join in. That is not defense of Jewish life, it is the misuse of Jewish power against the very people with whom, according to the Talmud, we are commanded to live for the sake of the ways of peace. So what follows theologically, if I were to be talking directly to the rabbis who are advocating this sort of misunderstanding of texts to the settlers? First, you should look after your leadership. The rabbinic leadership is something which is important, especially in the communities where students populate the outposts. It has to that has to stop speaking. You have to stop speaking in code. It is not enough to issue generic condemnation of violence while continuing to preach an absolutist theology of land possession. The specific misreadings need to be named. Lo Tachanem needs to be retaught in its context, not as a magical formula to nullify Palestinian property rights. The mitzvah of selling the land must be tethered again to the prophetic insistence that oppression of the stranger voids any claim to divine favor. Second, there must be a recovery of the strands of tradition that have already been highlighted here, that I've already talked about. The Meir's category of nations bound by the ways of religion and civilization, rabbinic rulings that recognize the legitimacy of non-Jewish political authority, and the consistent halakhic ban on theft and violence against Gentiles. Those are not liberal add-ons, they are integral to the classical sources, and they need to be taught, and they need to be addressed. specifically with reference to the settler violence. So again, if I'm addressing directly the rabbis and the settlers, you need to sort yourself out. Third point, the Jewish theology of the land needs to be reframed publicly as covenantal rather than appropriation. A covenantal land can be shared, administered, negotiated about, even surrendered in parts when human life requires it. A proprietary land, imagined as a divine real estate grant to one ethnic group alone, with divine estate agents, produces exactly the kind of reckless settler militancy we're now seeing, and it's fortified by ministers who announce that terrorists must die and leave it to soldiers and police to decide on the pavement of a refugee camp who counts as a terrorist and who does not. It's all wrong. Ben Gvir is wrong, the soldiers are wrong, the police are wrong, but most significantly, the rabbis are wrong to be teaching this misreading of texts. Finally, for those of us looking on from the outside, there's an ethical task too. It is tempting to reduce all this to some bad settlers or a few foreign rogue units. The footage from Jenin, the statistics on settler attacks, the repeated incursions into Syria, Lebanon and Gaza together tell a different story. There is a structure here, and part of that structure is a religious narrative that baptizes permanent domination as piety. That is wrong. And that narrative is not only the Jewish voice in the text, it's not the best one in the same Talmud from which extremists cherry-pick their slogans. There are other voices speaking of justice for the stranger, of peace as a religious obligation, of the horror of shedding innocent blood. There are those other sources that need to be amplified, taught and embodied precisely in places like Jenin, Tubas, Huwara and the Syrian border, where theology is currently being written in bullets, not in words. And the killings in Jenin will, as usual, be reviewed and almost certainly buried in a file. Whether they are also judged by the rabbinic tradition that settlers and their political patrons so often invoke is a different question and long overdue. If that tradition is honest with itself, and it should be, it will not celebrate men who shoot kneeling prisoners. It will recognize those men who are doing the shooting as transgressors. It will name the ideology that cheers them on, the ideology that turns sacred land into a license for cruelty as a betrayal of Torah rather than its fulfillment. That is what should be happening. That is the debate we should be having. And so, as I've said again repeatedly, in many ways I should be addressing you, the rabbinic community, who are perpetuating this misreading of the texts to the settlers. You need to sort yourself out.